justify. A reasonable accommodation is literally just a change or an exception or an adjustment to a rule, policy, or practice, right? So your building may say no animals at all, no, only birds that are gray, only cats that are less than 5 pounds. We have a dog policy. You can have all the dogs you want. You have to pay us $5,000 for each pet that you want. Whatever policy your building has with regards to animals or some other policy is, as far as the fair housing laws are concerned, fine. But if a person requires an accommodation, an exception to those because of their disability, an exception may have to be granted. Now, just because you give one person an exception, that does not open the door to all people who may want an exception. Each request for an accommodation or modification needs to be judged on its own merits. Now, a reasonable modification is pretty much what it sounds like. It's a physical change in the structure, right? Now, if it's a physical change in the structure in my unit versus if there's a physical change in the structure in a common area space, that's going to shift who's responsible for the costs. We're going to talk about that a little bit. Sometimes structural changes can be made, sometimes they cannot be made. We're going to be breaking that down in just a bit too. If you are interested, and I think that these are always good resources, HUD has put out some good guidance over the years on reasonable accommodations, reasonable modifications of animals, and all of that. So if you're interested, I've put together this list here, although when I try to click on it, it doesn't seem to work. But just if you Google joint statement between HUD and the Department of Justice, they have an FAQ style guidance that they have on reasonable accommodations. Yes, it's almost 20 years old. Yes, it is still valid. Many of us are still reading through it. So it is a good guidance to be given. And again, they pose it as FAQs, frequently asked questions. So if you want to understand what you should or should not do, that's a good place to start. It's not necessarily going to be controlling everywhere because, again, keep in mind, these guidances are put out with regards to the Federal Fair Housing Act, and there are some more stringent requirements under the state law and the county's law. But it's a good place to start, and I would always encourage you to speak to your attorneys before deciding one way or another as to whether you should be granting an accommodation or not. Then in 2008, they put out another joint statement on reasonable modifications. And in 2013, they put out a joint statement on design and construction, which we're going to touch on a little bit tonight, not too much, but I'm happy to answer any questions. They also put out in 2013 an assistance animal guidance. HUD put that out, but they revised that in 2020. So that supersedes it. So never mind the guidance you may see in 2013. But if you pull up that guidance that HUD put out on assistance animals in 2020, you'll find a lot of your questions may be answered there as well. So what does a request have to look like, right? And what are you allowed to do and how are you supposed to respond? So any request for an accommodation or for a modification, first you need to understand every request has to be granted or, considered on a case-by-case basis. Just because Jeff asked for it doesn't mean that Josh automatically gets it. Just because Josh got it doesn't mean that Tim automatically gets it, right? Every single request, even if we each have the same disabilities, has to be considered on its own merits, and things change over time. So you have to consider the reasonableness of each request as they come in. Requests can be made verbally or in writing. I certainly appreciate that most cooperatives and condominiums, you want to memorialize requests, and I see no problem with that. As an agency, I think that's a good practice. But sometimes people will come to you and make a verbal request. Sometimes their disability prevents them from actually writing something down or filling out the form. Once the community is aware that there's a need, that there's a request on the table, they have a duty to respond. They can't just simply sit back and say, well, you never filled that form XJ10, so we don't have to be responsive to it. You may have to have your property manager or office manager or board secretary or whomever complete the forms for them and help memorialize, but you still have to engage in that process. I see a question which I'm going to take right now. If a potential resident does not share in the application that there is a kind of handicap, but the board is aware of it, is the board supposed to give special preference for admission into the building? All right, so no, there is no requirement that a person with a disability is given any special preference. right? They just cannot be excluded because they're going to need an accommodation or they may require a modification down the road. And again, whether the person is applying to live in the community or they are already living there, there's no requirement that they first of all disclose that they need this accommodation or modification before they come in, even if they're aware of it. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as well. But if they do make that request, even if they are simply looking to move in, you would still have to engage with them to a certain extent. If they're interviewing with the co-op board and they're saying, I know that the dogs are not allowed, but I've got myself an emotional support animal or a seeing eye dog, and we're going to break that down in just a moment, you may very well have to grant or consider that request.
So Josh, I just want to let you know that some folks are in fact sending their questions directly, not to everybody. So we do have a queue of some of those. So it's not always necessarily representative of who's waiting just because their question pops up for everybody.
Oh, I see. So I'm going to move on and then we'll take those questions later. Thank you so much, Tim.
No problem.
All right. Oh, went too far. Okay. So requesting to be verbal or in writing. Housing providers have to engage. So this is what you have to do. When anybody comes to you with an accommodation request or a modification request, you really have to determine two things first, right? These are the first preliminary things. Does the person have a disability? And do they need the thing, right? Whether the thing is a ramp or strobe lighting or an emotional support animal, whatever it is, we're going to come back to that in a moment. But do they in fact have a disability? It's a good first question for you to answer. You are not entitled to know the nature of the disability. You don't get to have a HIPAA release. You don't get to talk to the doctor. You don't always get a note from the doctor, right? But you are entitled to have verifiable information that the person in fact has a disability. And once you can establish that, then you're entitled to understand what the thing is going to be for. Now, when you have a clear, visible disability such that a casual observer gets it right away, there's no further information that you are required to get, right? If I'm in a wheelchair and I'm asking you for a ramp, you don't need to know why I'm in a wheelchair. You don't need to know if it's congenital, if I got hit by a bus. It is irrelevant as to why I'm in the wheelchair. A casual observer can look at me and understand there is a disability. And a casual observer understands right away the connection between how my disability impacts me and the need for the thing I'm asking for. I'm in a wheelchair and I need a ramp. You get that. You understand that I need a ramp to get over the stairs. Once you can establish those two things, then the next question is it reasonable under these circumstances to grant this thing? We're going to come back to the ramp in just a moment. But if there's a clear disability and a clear need for the thing, no further analysis or inquiry should be made. Right? I'm asking for an assigned parking space close to the door. I show you my disability parking tag. That is sufficient information. The tag alone means I have a disability. The state has already vetted me as having a disability. The tag means I need a parking space. That's literally what it means. We all understand that, right? We challenge whether any doctor would sign everything and they don't even bother looking at the documents. You challenge it at your peril. Permit means I have a disability and I need the thing. Now, if I'm in a wheelchair and I'm saying, hey, I need an exception to the no dog policy and having a dog. Okay, well, Josh, I can see you have a disability. I need a little bit more information so I can understand what the function of the dog is. The housing providers, co-op boards, or whomever, you are entitled to minimally invasive information such that you can be clear that there is a disability and there is a need. You don't get to probe every aspect of the person's life or disability. Think of it. If you were the one who's making the request, do you really want to have to really divulge your entire medical history to your board or friends or neighbors? Not so much. They are absolutely entitled to have that minimally invasive information so they can make an informed decision, but you don't have to open the book on yourself on everything, right? So if in my second example, where I'm in a wheelchair and I'm asking for an exception to the no animal policy or the no dog policy. All right, Joshua, can you explain to me what the function of that dog is? And then I can explain how this dog perhaps has been specially trained to pull me along. I put a harness on and it pulls me along it drives my wheelchair. And also when I'm home, it's able to jump up on the counter and grab my medication and open doors and do all of these various things. So now I've made you understand what the function of the thing is. In this case, it's a dog, right? So that is what you're entitled to. When you have an invisible disability, like a psychiatric, psychological, emotional disability, of necessity, more often than not, you're not going to understand what the need for the thing is because you don't see that there's a disability. Oftentimes, physical disabilities can also be invisible. How many times have you seen a video or have wondered yourself when you see somebody who appears to be very able-bodied come out of a car that has a disability tag or disability license plate, and you think nothing seems to be wrong with them? You're not always going to be cognizant of the disability, but there is a disability nonetheless. But as a board or as a landlord or as a condo board, you may still want some more information. So if you have an invisible disability, when the person's asking for the thing, they need to be able to provide you with sufficient information so that you can be clear that, yeah, there's a need here. So when somebody comes to you and says, I need an emotional support animal, you are entitled to ask for verifiable proof that there is a disability and there is a need, right? Now, oftentimes where housing providers get themselves in trouble is demanding only a letter from an MD, only a letter from a doctor. Now, a doctor's letter may be best, and there are going to be some occasions when it is required. But requiring that I always only provide a doctor's letter to prove that I have a disability and that I have this need may be overreaching. I like to say that if I'm going to be going down to Times Square, it may be best for me to take my Ferrari, but that's not going to be the only vehicle that gets me to my destination, right? A Honda will do it, mass transit will do it, a bicycle will do it. There's a number of different vehicles that will take me to where I need to go, and it does not have to be only that which is best, and that would be the doctor. You are permitted to ask for information from an individual with firsthand information, some credible firsthand information that can make you clear as a housing provider that, yep, there's a disability, and yep, there's a need for this thing. I know there are some less than credible websites out there where, especially for things like emotional support animals, for $200, I can buy all kinds of accoutrement for my pets. I'm going to ask you to just mute yourself. Sorry. Thank you so much. There are some less than reputable websites out there where you can buy all kinds of accoutrement for your pets and slap on assistance animal on those things and try to pass off as an animal, as an assistance animal. Yes. Those things are valueless because it's not coming from a person with firsthand information. I caution you, though, just because somebody got that accoutrement does not mean that the animal is not an assistance animal or service animal. We're going to talk much more extensively in a little bit. The person with a disability may have been fooled themselves to spending much more money than they had to, thinking that all of that stuff would be good to prove their case. They may have wasted their money, but it does not mean that they don't need it. You are entitled to have some information from somebody who knows and understands both that there's a disability and a need. So my doctor can certainly make you understand how my disability impacts me and what the need is. My therapist may be in a good position to do that too. My parents may be in an excellent position to explain that to the board, right? I may have cerebral palsy. My parents may have been my primary healthcare providers for the last 45 years, and they are very well able to articulate to you exactly how my disability impacts me and why I need the thing. I may be able to clearly articulate to you the need. Now, if I'm not able to, or if I'm not able to substantiate the need, that's when you get to probe a little bit deeper and say, Josh, can you give us a little bit more? But always saying we're only going to take a doctor's letter and nothing but may be overly burdensome to the individual. And that may be a violation depending upon the circumstances. So remember, you're entitled to information. You're entitled to the minimally invasive information that you can verify that there is a disability and there is a need. And then you get to the question of whether it is reasonable under the circumstances. So some examples of reasonable accommodations can be anything like hiring an American Sign Language interpreter, allowing an assistance animal, helping a person complete the application differently, transferring units, adjusting rent schedules, or maintenance schedules, or disability parking spaces, right? Now, if there's any cost to be borne for an accommodation, then the cost is to the community, to the cooperative or the condo or to the landlord. right? So if I, as a shareholder, need to communicate with the property manager or the superintendent about something, and I need the use of an American Sign Language interpreter, then the cost for that interpreter would be to the community itself, to the cooperative, a condo, or et cetera. If you need to repaint lines to create another parking space, if that's reasonable under the circumstances, then the cost would be to the community. For some things, like if I only receive my disability Social Security income on the 5th of each month, and everyone's maintenance is due on the 1st of the month, it may be a proper accommodation to me, both for my disability and also my source of income, to grant me that accommodation to allow me to pay my maintenance on the 5th of the month or the 6th of the month, depending upon the circumstances, right? Examples of reasonable modifications could be things like allowing me to install strobe lighting in my unit, or installing a ramp leading up to the door of the main entrance of the building, or widening doorways, or lowering kitchens and bathrooms. Again, this is far from exhaustive. There's all kinds of accommodations or modifications that may be asked for. Now, importantly, we're going to explore this a little bit more later. If there's a cost to be borne for a modification, if the modification is inside my unit, the cost is mine to bear, right? I still have to ask permission of my landlord or the co-op board or whatever to be allowed to make those modifications, and you have to go through that same analysis. Does Josh have a disability? Does Josh have a need for this thing? And if so, then is it reasonable under the circumstances to allow this modification to happen? Now, certainly you can ask for the condition of the unit to be returned to its original condition when and if I leave. So, for example, if I'm looking for to remove a bathtub and install a wheelchair accessible shower so I can get my wheelchair in, that might be a reasonable modification to allow me to make at my expense. You may require that once I leave the unit, I reinstall the bathtub and remove that wheelchair accessible shower, right? You don't have to, but you can. That's fine. But if there's a cost to be borne for a modification to a common area space, even if I'll be the only one to use it today, because tomorrow things change, right? The cost is to the community. Now, that's the difference between the federal law and the state and county. Under the federal law, if there's a physical change in the structure anywhere, the cost is to the individual. But under the state and county law, if there's a physical change in a common area space leading up to the mailroom, leading up to the pool, to the gym, leading up to the main entrance of the building, the rear patio, whatever, if there's a cost to be borne to automate those doors or build the ramp or anything along those lines, the cost is to the community, right? There are certainly some grants out there and some funds that are available through a variety of agencies. I'm not familiar with them all, and those grants change. HUD puts out some grants. I know the state government puts out some grants. If you contact Westchester Residential Opportunities, if they're not administrating those grants or administering those grants, they certainly are usually aware of where those grants are. So that's usually reaching out to not-for-profits like them are usually a pretty good resource, and they can guide you. So if there's an individual who needs that, if the community somehow needs it, that may be a good place to explore. Let's talk a little bit about parking spaces as accommodations before we move on to animals, because I think that this is always a hot button topic, and I do think it's necessary to discuss. So oftentimes in condos, it's a little bit different than in cooperatives, right? In condominiums, usually, not always, condominiums, people own their space outright in fee simple. And if that's the case, and a person requires a parking space, a condominium cannot necessarily just strip somebody of their own property. That's not usually going to be reasonable, if ever. Now, if the condominium owns some parking spaces and can reassign spaces, there may be something for them to do. We're going to specifically look at things where the housing provider actually owns and controls all the spaces, which is usually, not always, but usually the cooperatives and usually landlords. If you can assign spaces and reassign spaces, there may be a reasonable accommodation sometimes you have to make in reassigning a space to somebody who has a disability tag. So let's have a hypothetical. And Tim, I'm going to use you for this example too. So I've been living in this cooperative for 50 years, and I have a parking space that abuts the main entrance of the door. It's right next to it. There's 2 parking spaces that are right next to the door. I've been there for 50 years. I have no disabilities, but I like that space very much. I waited long enough, and that's my space. Thank you. Now, aside from those two spaces by the door, 100 feet away, there's a garage with 200 other parking spaces, and they're all full. And there's 500 people waiting on a wait list to get more parking spaces because parking is a premium, and people waiting for 10 or 15 years to get a parking space. And everyone would love to have a parking space today. Now, Tim comes into our community. He's brand new. He's been there for 2 weeks, and he comes to the property manager and then eventually the co-op board and says, "Hey, I have this disability tag, and I need a parking space right next to the door because that's what my disability requires." Right? He's brand new. He was on the waiting list just like everybody else, but he's the first person, strangely enough, to ask for disability accommodation in a parking space. And that closest space to the door, again, I've been there for 50 years, but I don't need it. I like it, but I don't need it. Tim needs it. Does Tim get the space? In that circumstance, he probably is. Josh is not going to be happy. The board should reassign my parking space and give that space to Tim. Now, importantly, the board should not disclose to me, "Hey, Josh, we're kicking you out because Tim has a disability and Tim needs a space." I do not need to have that information. The board needs to hold that in confidence, right? You were shared the invasive information so that you can make a determination. I did not need to have that information. I'm not on the board, right? Tim disclosed to you that he has a disability. Josh does not need to know about Tim's disability. You reassign that space, and when Josh comes yelling and screaming at you about why you took away his parking space, your answer needs to be something along the lines of, "Because the board determined that's what we needed to do," right? We reassigned the space because that's what we decided as a board we should do, and Josh won't be happy. And maybe you put Josh on the waiting list, or maybe you now shuffle us around and somebody along the lines is going to lose their parking space. And that's what you have to do because Tim required that space. Now, soon after Tim required that space or asked for the space, all of a sudden, John realized that he needed this space too. And he's got a disability tag and he can ask. So now he comes over and says, "Hey, I need a space too." And the person that's in that space that was next to me, they've been there for 30 years. Also not disabled, but they're also very comfortable in that space. Do they have to be displaced for John? In that circumstance, they probably do. And John would get that next parking space. And now you get 5 or 10 more people going, "Oh, we didn't know we could do that." So now they all say, "We've all got disability parking spaces. We all want parking spaces next to the door as well." Do you have to accommodate those? Not necessarily. Well, do you have to determine who's most disabled? Not your responsibility. It is not a board's responsibility to sit in place of a doctor and triage. Please don't do that, right? You're not supposed to be determining who's most disabled. Does Timothy's this disability trump Josh's that disability? Not a question you need to ask. It's really a question of first and time to make the request, right? So whereas Josh was evicted to put Tim in and my neighbor was evicted to put John in, now when Jane comes over and asks for her parking space, what should the board do? Well, you can't remove an accommodation for a person with a disability to give it to somebody else. That makes no sense. But you have to explore and engage in an interactive process to see what else can you do, right? So in that circumstance, perhaps you can paint a new set of lines and create a new space for Jane. If there's room for it and it's reasonable, that might be the reasonable accommodation to do. But if it's not, you can't just simply say, "Sorry, Jane, so sad, too bad." You may have to look at the next closest parking space, which is 100 feet away, but look at the next closest parking space, give her that parking space, and again, reassign, and you're going to have some unhappy people, and then create a new wait list for people with disabilities for the next closest parking space. Eventually, you may run out of parking spaces, and they may just simply have to wait. Again, the circumstances have changed. Whereas giving a space to Tim was reasonable and giving a space to John was reasonable and giving a space to Jane was reasonable, perhaps now the circumstances have changed and is no longer reasonable. So that's why I say every request for an accommodation has to be based on the circumstances, on a case-by-case basis and on circumstances as they exist. Things changed between when Tim first asked and when Jane next asks. Let's talk about animals. When we're talking about animals as reasonable accommodations, don't treat them any differently than you would a request for a ramp or an automated door or a parking space. The analysis is the same, all right? You need to understand, is there a disability? Is there a need for this thing, all right? Once you can check off those two questions, then the question becomes, is it reasonable under the circumstances to allow it, right? So in general, when we're talking about assistance animals, and again, let me delineate, because most of us have heard those terms ADA and service animals and emotional support animals, whatever a number of myriad terms you may have heard when it comes to animals, don't get too hung up on those. All right, whether it's a service animal like a seeing eye dog or a seeing eye Shetland pony, which can be a thing, or an emotional support dog or emotional support potbelly pig, or an emotional support ball python, which can be a thing, or trained capuchin, or hearing cat or hearing dog, or something along those lines. Don't get too caught up in the term that's associated with them, because depending upon the circumstances, many of these animals may qualify to be reasonable accommodations. Under the ADA, which stands for the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is a federal statute that in large part pertains to your place of employment and places of public accommodation, like movie theaters and restaurants. The Department of Justice has determined what is and is not a service animal. It's a very limited definition. Where we live is different and the rules are different. So don't worry about the ADA, because as discussed before, we're in large part not dealing with the ADA. There are some buildings where the ADA in Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act may apply, but in large part, we're talking about the Federal Fair Housing Act, New York State Human Rights Law, and the Westchester County Fair Housing Law. The rules and the requirements and the standards are different. And those animals which may not be service animals in your employment setting or a public accommodation may very well be a proper and reasonable accommodation under the fair housing laws, right? Importantly, those animals are not pets. So again, your community may have whatever pet policy or animal policy that they want. When it comes to assistance animals, which is what we're going to be calling them, that large umbrella, we can use the term assistance animals for all these animals, be it a service animal or emotional support animal. They are not pets. I want you to think of requests for assistance animals to be similar to a request for a ramp, because every bit as much as somebody in a wheelchair may need a ramp, a person with certain disabilities may require that assistance animal. And if it is necessary, it should be granted. If you're looking at a circumstance where you have an average household pet, you're clear that the person has a disability and the need, again, no further inquiry should be made. And generally, you probably want to grant it. So I come into your community, you have a no animal policy or no dog policy, and I come to you with my seeing eye dog. All right, I have my glasses on, the dog is on its leash. Do you need any further information? You do not. A casual observer understands right away that I have a disability, and you don't need to know why I have my disability, what the nature of my disability is, and you understand the function of the thing, in this case, the dog. No further inquiry needs to be made. I gave you that hypothetical before of me being in a wheelchair and needing the dog, and you get to ask a little bit more detail about what the function of the dog is, right? But for emotional support animals, and I understand, again, many of you, you're not going to see the disability. It's an invisible one, so many of us are not going to understand the need for the thing. You don't necessarily need to know that I have PTSD from my time in Afghanistan, right? And the animal helps me breathe and calm down. You don't need to understand necessarily that I'm agoraphobic, and that the animal, by simply needing to go out on a walk 3 times a day, forces me to go outside. Those are not things that I need to disclose, although I may choose to. I may find it easier as the individual to disclose some of those details so that you can be clear as to the nature of my disability and why I need it. But I don't have to necessarily disclose those things, and you're not entitled to ask those questions. Now, importantly, there are some animals like seeing eye dogs and seeing eye Shetland ponies that have tens of thousands of dollars of training put into them and hours put into them, all kinds of things to make sure that they are qualified, trained animals. And there are some animals that may qualify as proper assistance animals under the fair housing laws that weren't trained by an agency, but by the individual, right? I may have paralysis from the neck down, and I have a specially trained capuchin monkey that I have trained that's able to open up my medication, right? That obviously a dog could not do, or open doors, or perform a whole other slew of tasks that your household, your garden variety household animal cannot do. That might be a proper accommodation under the circumstance. But not every assistance animal actually requires training. Things like those emotional support animals we talked about before. The benefit of the animal may be the animal itself, right? Now, importantly, there's a wide menagerie of animals, as you can see right here, that may qualify, and some of those animals may be unusual, but that does not necessarily mean that they are going to be unreasonable. You do need to understand why this particular animal may be necessary, right? So you may have a child with autism who can only really connect with iguanas. Sometimes that is the case. And again, a little bit of probing is not always uncalled for the minimally invasive information. But just because an animal is unusual does not necessarily mean that you get to reject them. You're not going to have an emotional support cobra. You're not going to have a seeing eye grizzly bear. There are some animals that the state has determined to already be dangerous, and as a result, they are going to be not reasonable. So don't worry about that aspect of things too much, all right? But unusual animals like capuchin monkeys or potbelly pigs or a ball python may qualify and be necessary and appropriate accommodations under the fair housing laws. Let me just make sure there's nothing here that I want to touch base on. Okay. Yeah. But when we're talking about assistance animals, emotional support animals certainly fall under that umbrella. I get it. Many of us get concerned that somebody is trying to game the system, that they're trying to pretend that their pet is some kind of an emotional support animal and they're going to lie about it. That happens much less than many of us think. Certainly we hear these things in the news or read them in the papers. Understand that news is often sensationalized. I'm not saying that nobody ever lies about it, but anytime you get a request for an accommodation or for a modification, you need to go through that process. It's when the boards or the property manager or the landlord decide, I'm just going to ignore the request. I think you're full of it. I think this is garbage, and you choose not to engage, or you just outright reject, that you usually get into trouble, or you get an agency like mine coming to knock on your door to ask why you've engaged or refused to engage, or why you refuse the accommodation, which again doesn't always mean that they need it and doesn't always mean that it's reasonable, but oftentimes communities get themselves in trouble when they refuse to engage. If you go through that processing for each and every time, if it's not a clear disability, there's not a clear need, we're going to ask you to make us understand that there is a disability and that there is a need. And then you get to probe whether it's reasonable under the circumstances. Now, just to be clear, when we're talking about what is reasonable under the circumstances, it's not, we don't feel like spending the money, right? We have it, we just don't feel like it. Or we really don't like Josh, he's the pain in the butt, so we're not going to do it. In order for something to not be reasonable, there has to be either an undue financial and administrative burden to the community, or there has to be some other kind of undue hardship, like there's a danger to the community. So let me give you an example. If I have a seeing eye dog that one day, and again, they've had lots of training, one day it breaks its training and then it's biting somebody or attacking somebody or snapping at somebody, am I still entitled to have that seeing eye dog? Probably not. Now, the community may ask me to muzzle the animal or take some steps to safeguard, but if that animal has proven itself to be dangerous, it may no longer be reasonable. I may still be entitled to have a seeing eye dog, but not necessarily that seeing eye dog, because that animal has proven itself to be a direct threat to the community, to the health and safety of the community. But it wasn't something that you anticipated or you were simply afraid of. So if I have an emotional support animal that's a pit bull or a Rottweiler, the community can't say, no, you can't have that because we've heard about that breed, or I'm afraid of those kinds of dogs. Now, if the dog has never proven itself to be a danger, it may be the sweetest dog. And I'm not just saying that because I've had a pit bull and I do think they're very sweet dogs, very needy, but very sweet. You can't determine based on the breed that you think it's a dangerous animal. The animal has to have proven itself to be a direct threat by attacking or biting or something along those lines. If it has not done that, you cannot exclude that animal. You can't say, Josh, we understand that you have a need for an emotional support animal. We understand you have a disability. We just won't let you have the pit bull, even though you've already bonded with it. That might be a violation of the fair housing laws. right? You have to judge the animal for itself. And again, it may be unusual, but not necessarily dangerous. I'm sure you'll have more questions about that, so we'll move on. A quick note before we move on to briefly reasonable modifications. Understand that after that amendment in 1988 of the Fair Housing Act, and the state and the county have adopted these standards as well, any new construction for first occupancy, any new construction for multifamily building after March 13th, 1991, has to have a whole slew of accessibility and adaptability already built into it, right? So anything that was built after that date, anything that was built before that date does not necessarily already have to be accessible or adaptable, but that does not mean that it's been grandfathered in. That is not a thing. A modification still may be necessary, even if your building was constructed back in the 50s or 60s or the 1920s. There may be a modification required to allow somebody with a disability access to their home, right? And all an accommodation or modification really is an acknowledgement that these things, the environment was not built originally to be accessible, right? And we're going to try to now correct that. After that 1991 date, there's all of these requirements. We're not going to go through them today. If you're really interested, if you go through, there's an initiative through HUD called Fair Housing Accessibility First, I believe. If you go to the website, there's a 304 page manual that has all of these 7 listings and tells you all the things that a building constructed after this date for multifamily use requires, right? Just be aware. But if your building was built before then, and as discussed before, if there's a physical change in the structure to a common area space, the cost would be to the community, right? Then a modification may have to be made. A ramp may have to be constructed. The doors may have to be automated. Doorways may have to be widened if it is reasonable, right? So let us explore another hypothetical. I own a 3-story walk-up building, pre-war, no elevator, right? I've got 2 tenants on each floor, and Tim, sorry to use you as an example again, Tim lives up on the 3rd floor of my building, and Tim is perfectly able to get up and down the stairs all the live long day. But alas, one day tragedy befalls Tim, and now he's in a wheelchair. And he comes to me as a landlord and says, "Hey Josh, I need you to build an elevator so this way I can get up to my 3rd floor apartment." Now, do I need more information from him? Not so much. Can I see that he has a disability? Yes, I can. Do I see the need for the elevator? Yes, I do, right? I understand the need for the elevator right away. He clearly cannot take himself up the 3 flights of stairs in his wheelchair. Do I have to build the elevator? Well, it depends, right? A lot depends here. First, this may be the only building I own like this, and I don't know the amounts of things. I'm going to make up the numbers. Let us say the building cost me $3 million. Again, I don't know. And let us say to construct this elevator, it's going to cost me $2 million. I don't know how much elevators cost, right? And this is the only property I own. I don't have $2 million. That may be an undue financial and administrative burden for me, whereas I can't build that elevator. Under that circumstance, it may not be reasonable for me to build that elevator. Or perhaps I have all the money, but the building would not structurally support construction like that. And so under that circumstance, it would not be reasonable. Or perhaps it could structurally support it, and I do have the money, but perhaps I would have to evict all my other tenants while this construction is happening, and that may not be reasonable. All right, but if all of those other circumstances are okay, I don't have to kick out anybody, I do have the money, I've got billions of dollars, it would structurally support, there may be a circumstance where I would have to construct that elevator. So it's not always going to be so clear cut. I'd rather not spend the money, but I may have to, under the circumstances, construct it. But assuming that I can't do it because it's not reasonable in the circumstances, I can't say to Tim, "So sad, too bad. I'll let you break the lease, be well," right? I have to engage Tim in what's known as an interactive process. I can't give you the thing that you're asking for, Tim, but let's explore what we can do. And it may be reasonable to grant Tim a move from his 3rd floor unit. Maybe I have a vacancy on the 1st floor unit, and maybe I can move him to that unit. That might be a reasonable accommodation. It's not the thing that he wanted, but under the circumstances, it is the most reasonable thing to do. I may be able to, at my cost, construct or have constructed a wheelchair accessible lift that takes him up 3 stories all the way up to his apartment, and then I'll take him up and down all the live long day. That might be the reasonable thing to do, and then I would have to do that. But if after exploring all these options with Tim and we're not able to find any accommodation or modification that would suit him, there may simply be nothing for me to do. And that would not be a violation of the fair housing laws. Sometimes that's just life. But I had to engage with him in a good faith effort to address. It wasn't that I didn't want to build the elevator, I couldn't. It wasn't that I didn't want to accommodate or modify in some way. There was nothing to be done, right? But I had to explore that. That is your responsibility as a co-op board, as a condo board, as a landlord. You have to engage in that interactive process when the thing that's being requested is not reasonable. You don't get to substitute the interactive process because you don't want to do the thing. I don't really want to build you a ramp, Josh, so how about we do something else? If it's reasonable in the circumstances, you got to give me the parking space, allow me to have an emotional support animal of a pit bull, etc. Right? It's only when it's not reasonable that you then engage in that interactive process to see what else can be done.